Hello, Professor Eric Martin, and today I am here to help you set up Chapter 7 from Worlds of History, The Spread of Universal Religions. Now, in the previous chapter, we looked at a historical process, and we looked at it in two different ways. And the historical process was looking at how small religions with limited tribal appeal. All right, looking at Judaism and Hinduism, religions that you really have to be born into. They're not very attractive for converts. And looking at how these two religions develop into universal religions and religions with a broader appeal, and develop into a couple of the great faiths of the world today. As Hinduism develops into Buddhism, but then also develops salvation branches of Hinduism that become more popular. And then how Judaism transforms into Christianity, and then later on we'll have the break off of that into Islam, right? So they're all related. This week, the material looks at how once these religions develop a universal appeal, and we're really talking in this particular case about Buddhism, about Christianity, and about Islam. How once these religions develop a universal appeal and begin to spread out geographically, what happens to the religions? How do the religions change based on where they go? How is Christianity in China different than Christianity on the western end of the Mediterranean, for example? How is Islam different in Arabia and in West Africa? These kinds of things. So depending on the place that they go, how do these religions change? And then also, how do they stay the same? Because I think that we can learn something pretty interesting by looking at these different variables, right? Or the constant and the variable. Again, if you want to think about history as sort of a scientific experiment, then what we're looking at now is a process, and we're looking to see at the religious constants and the religious variables, and then we can decide, in this particular case, what both the constants and the variables have to tell us about these broader processes of expanding religion. Now, the materials this week, you got a couple of secondary sources that you need to pay attention to, and then the rest are primary sources. The secondary sources, one of them is entitled The Invention of the Jewish People, in which he makes an argument that we should reconsider what I just said about Judaism being a tribal religion with limited appeal. So take a look at that one. The other article is a very famous article, The Islamization of the Silk Road. And read that carefully, because that argument is a really interesting one, in which we're laying out this idea that more than trade moves on trade routes. Cultures move on trade routes. Later on, we'll see diseases move on trade routes. Food moves on trade routes. And ideas move on trade routes, ideas about religion and what it means to be a Muslim during the early medieval period on the Silk Roads. Read those carefully, and you might even read those two first before you get into the primary sources. And then I just want to talk about the primary sources for a few moments here, so that you know what you're getting yourself into. The life of Constantine, right? This is a major turning point in the history of Christianity, as the Roman emperor himself openly declares his faith. But the question becomes, why did he do it? Read the document. What's his motive? All right, what are his motives? This idea of a conversion process. And why would someone convert from one religion to another religion? We've got this other document, which is from an inscription by Nestorian Christians. You might never have heard of Nestorian Christians, but Nestorian Christians were the angle of Christianity that became popular in East Asia, in China. Take a look at how things change amongst the Nestorians and where their emphasis on Christianity is. That's a really good way to think about it, because I think a lot of times what we forget is after the death of Christ, there's not really anything called Christians. There's a small Jesus movement. And then that becomes the big discussion, right? Well, what does it mean to be a Christian? And you've got all these different groups that have different answers for it. And there is a multitude of different kinds of ways, different beliefs. Should we really focus on the idea that, Jesus died on the cross and came back? Or should we focus, is it his words that really matter? And then there's debates and arguments between those groups of people. And then some went outright and these become the dominant faith, the Orthodox faith, right? So keep that in mind as we go through this stuff. This Nestorian Christian stuff's pretty interesting. Then we've got another document in which the Buddhists from India, Indian missionaries, are attempting to convert Chinese to Buddhism. And the Chinese aren't interested. Not interested in foreign religions. How do the Indian Buddhists attempt to make Buddhism appealing to Chinese? And what are the Chinese critiques of Buddhism? The next three primary sources more or less focus on Islam. We've got some selections from the Quran. They can be tough to read sometimes, okay? One of the ways to think about that is, as you're reading them, think about what are some of the issues that were facing the Muslim community. Why would these things be written about in the first place? So you can start with that if you don't know what else to think about. Think about that. And also, don't forget, our editor, Kevin Riley, has written up a very nice Thinking Historically section, a very nice preface for each of the documents. You would be silly not to be reading that material. It helps the documents make sense. All right, other documents we have. We have the peace terms with Jerusalem. And basically, it is a document by Arab Muslims to the Christian community in Jerusalem in terms of how things are going to work in Jerusalem. Read that. Might not be what you think. It's kind of interesting. And then the final primary source we have is from a little later period, but I still think it's interesting. It's the Epic of Sundiata. If you take my African history course live and in person, we are going to read the Epic of Sundiata in full. It is a very interesting tale about the first king of the Mali Empire. Disney's movie, The Lion King, was loosely, and I mean very loosely, based on this story. But the point is, take a look at the Epic of Sundiata. Take a look at the conversion process. Same kind of questions as with Constantine. Who's converting? Why are they converting? What's the context of the whole thing? And I think that's something for you to think about in general as you go through all these documents. Why do individuals in these various sources adopt a particular religion? Why would you convert? What motivation could you have to convert? And I think if you just kind of think about that as you go through each of these, that might be a good thing to keep in mind. Also, don't forget about Traditions and Encounters, that textbook. Read the material relevant for the spread of the world's religions. Because the other question that I have for you that I think would be interesting for you to talk about on the discussion boards goes like this. Do you think it's a coincidence that the world's great religions, that the development of the world's great religions, that Christianity and Buddhism and Islam become widespread popular religions? Do you think it's a coincidence that this happens along with the development of equally large and powerful political and economic empires? What's the connection between the Roman Empire and the spread of Christianity? What's the connection between imperial support in India and in China for a particular religion and its spread? What's the connection for political support for Islam and its spread? Pay attention to those things, because I think that'll help kind of make some sense about why some of these religions spread the way they do. But it's a fun topic, I think, to get into. Anyway, that's all I've got for you today. Enjoy your reading. Do this chapter slow. All right, these are not necessarily the most straightforward readings. So, as usual, if you got questions about any of this stuff, call me on the phone in the office, send me an email through our Blackboard website, drop by the office. I'm glad to help you. I want to make sure that you're having a good learning experience. And until then, enjoy your historical studies.